Hello and welcome to the Supernatural Fandom Track here at Continual. Today I'm talking with author Dr. Janina Scarlet, and she's written the book Supernatural Therapy. So we're going to talk about, oh, she's got the book right there. That is great. So we're going to talk about gaining some real life psychological insight from a couple of characters who might not be anybody's poster child for mental health. As heroic as they are. So, Janina, please tell us all about yourself, and then we'll get talking about this amazing book.
Of course, Gail, thank you so much for having me on the show again. It's honestly my honor, and I love talking about Supernatural. It's one of my favorite TV shows of all time. And I think that for so many people, the show has been a symbol of hope, right?
Mhm.
Because a lot of times we might feel alone facing our own internal monsters, whether it's a monster of depression or grief or trauma. And the show has done an amazing job of creating metaphor around our internal struggles. I don't know if that was the intention of the show, but that is how a lot of fans are interpreting it. And so having these incredible characters who are fighting dragons on a regular basis, who are fighting monsters, right, demons and werewolves and vampires, it allows us a sense of hope that maybe we're not alone in this. And so I think that the show has become a symbol of mental health and togetherness for a lot of people, as have supernatural cons.
Mhm.
And so in that supernatural family, in the SPN family, people have really found their support group.
Well, and of course, Jared Padalecki,
Yeah.
who's Sam Winchester, has spoken very candidly about his own struggles with depression and written chapters in There'll Be Peace When You Are Done and Family Don't End with Blood
Yep.
about you know, his struggle. And I think that that has really empowered a lot of fans to come forward and talk about what they're dealing with, because if Sam, the character, and Jared, the actor, can deal with it, well, then it creates a safe space for regular people who are fans to talk about it.
Exactly. And so when we see a representation of what we're going through modeled in such a compassionate and kind way, it allows us to feel more understood and it takes the stigma out of this experience. Both Jared Jensen and actually a whole bunch of other people also wrote supportive messages for fans in Supernatural Therapy. And so the idea is that we're able to see that we're not alone and we're able to receive support within that particular fandom. And I think for so many Supernatural fans, the show has become a home and Supernatural fandom has become a family. And so I think that's why people are so devastated now that the show is ending. And it's understandable because it feels like this part of ourself is going away. But of course, in a lot of ways, it doesn't have to.
Well, and of course, people have come into the fandom at all different places. For the
Yeah.
people who have been on board for the whole 15-year journey, waiting week by week for the next installment, this has been a huge chunk of your life, like any 15-year chunk.
Of
For
course.
those of us who came in at various stages after the ball was rolling, we've still gained a very deep connection to the show, but it is a little different
Sure.
than having had it be part of your life ongoing for all those years, because everybody's life goes through some kind of transition in a 15-year period, no matter how stable your life may seem.
Of course. And having this constant
Mhm.
of every week I'm going to get a new episode and having that change now, of course, that's devastating.
Now, Sam and Dean are certainly heroes. They take down vampires and werewolves, and in season 14 and 15 they're fighting against God himself. They've really come up against all the possible big bads, and yet, I wasn't completely joking when I said they aren't necessarily the template for mental health. Dean says he deals with things by pushing them down and then letting them out in bouts of violence and alcoholism. And, Sam drinks his fair share, as well as just, represses. And it really hasn't been until maybe season 13 that the boys finally started to use their words and talk to each other. So I think it's interesting that they kind of emerge as archetypes here, because many of their coping strategies have not been ideal over the years.
Certainly, and we see both really poor coping strategies, and we also see great coping strategies. So the poor coping strategies that we're seeing throughout the show are taking things upon themselves without letting their brother or other people know about what they're going through, right? Thinking that they have to like carry that cross themselves, avoiding coping with their traumas, not disclosing about the nightmares or the difficulties that they're facing. But the really positive ways in which that they're coping is that they're making meaning out of what happened to them. Because they lost their mother in a really traumatic way when they were children, they spend their lives finding other monsters that are hurting other people and making sure that other people don't lose a family member the way that they did. And even when, I apologize if this is a spoiler, but even when they get their mother back and then they don't, but even when that happens, they don't stop. And so I think what it really shows is that they're not just out for vengeance.
Mhm.
They have learned from their pain, and they want to make sure that nobody else goes through the same thing that they are. This is called post-traumatic growth. And post-traumatic growth is a kind of positive change that happens to some people after they go through something traumatic, where they find meaning in their experience and they use it to give back to other people who are maybe at the very beginning of this traumatic situation.
So is very akin to somebody who loses a parent to cancer and decides to become an oncologist, so
Yes,
nobody else has to deal with it.
exactly.
And the boys are good at that. They are good at what they do, arguably the best there is, which is why they keep running up against these mega bad guys.
Yeah.
And I think it's been interesting with this emerging showdown with Chuck, aka God, watching fans' reactions to that, because I suspect that everyone at some point in their life has had that midnight hour where they're wrestling with the Almighty or fate or whatever you want to call it. Sam and Dean get to punch him in the face. Um, but there's been a lot of ambivalence in some corners of fandom where they, oh, we can't really be God. We really can't fight God. And can you talk a little bit about that? Because some people go in swinging and other people go, I'm not sure I'm ready for this.
That's fine. I think that as fans, we have the ability to interpret things the way that it makes sense for us. The fandom is meant to be a safe space. And so if any of it seems uncomfortable, it is perfectly okay to change the narrative or even rewrite, in terms of a fan fiction episode, for example. And it's okay to have a different perspective. For example, for some, they view Chuck as the literal God, the way that it's written, but some view him as kind of the ultimate monster, or some kind of like a narcissistic controlling being, like maybe a narcissistic parent that's meant to sometimes to look out for us, but a lot of times is actually either absent or is involved in our suffering and is just doing things for their own pleasure and benefit. And so, if it's too hard to look at it in a literal sense, we can always look at it as a metaphor.
And I think it's interesting that such a strong theme in the show, team free will, this whole struggle for really all of the years, even when the show didn't have a clue that it was going to go on 15
Yeah.
years, it's been this battle between, to put it in theological terms, free will and predestination. that heaven and hell have a set plan that must not be deviated from, as opposed to screw destiny, we're going to make our own way.
Right.
That definitely factors into some psychological approaches as well.
Of course. Well, Sam was predetermined to be not just a demon, but the demon, right? And lead the demon army. But he was able to change that. And I think in a lot of ways, many of us think that we're destined to a certain lifestyle, either because maybe our family members or other people put us on a certain path, and we think that that means we have to follow this path, or maybe because we've been through something awful, maybe some kind of a trauma, and we think that we are too quote unquote broken to make a difference. And so we might create our own narrative that might be very unhealthy. And yet, as we're learning from the show, and as we also see in real life, and in both in research studies and from other people, we know that we have the ability to change our own destiny. We are able to make our own choices. They might be harder, but they might be worth it. And that's exactly what the boys do most of the time, right? They're able to change not only their destiny, but the world's destiny, preventing multiple apocalypses from happening because uh, they believe that their path is important. They're able to remember what they stand for, and even if it's hard, they're able to find it. So I think for many of us, it's remembering the big picture. When we have that choice between following the predetermined road or taking the road less traveled, if there's a calling there, it might be worthwhile, and it might be challenging, but it's worthwhile in the end.
I think that that's a really interesting way of looking at it, because so much of the show hinges on breaking away from what other people expect of you, what other people think many times reduced expectations. Even Sam and Dean have had that of each other, that you're not going to beat addiction. You're not going to beat the mark of Cain. You're not going to, I don't know if I can trust you. And they still manage to come back together again. Not always using their words as well as they could or should, but it's the Winchester way. Where does that redemption arc factor into all of this?
Yeah. And I actually think that goes hand in hand with following these expectations, right? Because for so many people, when we go through a hard time or when something terrible has happened to us, we might blame ourselves. And a lot of times, the bad things that have happened are either not our fault or outside of our control. Like, for example, even in the first season, Sam losing Jess, he spends most of that year blaming himself for her death, even though he had nothing to do with it. He didn't cause it to happen. And just because he was having psychic dreams didn't mean that he realized that they were going to lead to it actually happening. And so I think that for a lot of us, we might go through something that in the moment makes us think that we don't really have another choice. And then later, for something that lasted maybe 10 seconds, whether it's, us hurting somebody or maybe doing something that we later regret, we might spend years regretting this and often thinking that there's no redemption from this, that there's no coming back from this. But once again, there's always a choice, and we can always choose to do things differently in the future. We can always choose to make things better. And I think that's what the boys show time and time and time again, is that we always have a choice.
And they always manage to muster up forgiveness.
Yeah.
Even Dean, who holds a grudge like nobody's business,
Yeah.
has finally come to say, I'm good with who I am, and I'm good with who you are. And I wouldn't change what we've been through because it made us who we are. And to say, I'm putting all of it behind me. I've forgiven that a long time ago. I'm just glad you're here with me. That's a huge growth for that character.
Absolutely, because whereas when they first met Jack, Sam and Dean were quite not trusting of him. Dean especially didn't want anything to do with him. But now Dean not only loves Jack as his own brother, but also has at least seemingly forgiven him for killing Mary. And so it's certainly a big growth, but I also think because of the amount of people that the boys have lost along the way, I think that they're more inclined to keep people close to them.
I thought it was very interesting in this most recent episode, or one of the most recent episodes, where Dean tells Jack, I'm still angry with you. That's
Hmm.
going to take a while.
Yep.
But he still made the choice that he was not going to kill Jack.
Yep.
And that's a big step for Dean. I mean, it took him a long time to even get to that point of being able to use words like that with Sam. They spent so much of those early years at odds because nobody would sit down and have, a 10-minute conversation.
Yep.
Even Kevin's ghost told them to chill out and talk. And
Yeah.
so I love that the show has let the boys grow up in that way, that they're not still forced into being 22 and 26 like when the show started.
Yeah, exactly. I feel the same way, and I love Dean being able to express himself, and I think it once again shows that we can love somebody and be angry at them at the same time, right? It's not these polar kind of emotions. We can experience two seemingly opposite emotions at the same time. And yeah, there's been a lot of growth on both their parts, but especially with Dean and his ability of expressing himself over the years.
Well, one of the things that really was one of those growth trends in the show is when Sam first started to show some supernatural abilities, the dreams and those things. Dean had been raised that if it's supernatural, you kill it. If it's not normal, it's a monster, and monsters are always bad, and it's my job to kill them. And he was really forced to rethink that because he didn't want to kill Sam. And that led to the whole it's not what you are, it's what you do. And that was true not only with Sam, but with Lenore and with Garth and Jack and
Yeah.
so many other characters.
Yep.
That's a really important point that both boys had to reckon with, but that also rings true in a lot of real life.
Of course. Of course. And I think for so many people, they might have been raised to believe that certain groups are bad. And yet, it is when they're able to meet with somebody from that group and have a kind and compassionate exchange that maybe our own prejudices can reduce and go away. And how much better would our life be if all of us were able to have face to face conversations with people that are very different from us and where we're able to talk about things that we have in common, whether it's our love of certain TV shows or other hobbies. And I think world would be a much better place if we could all do that.
Absolutely. And there's also that ability of accepting those things within ourselves. I mean, some
Mhm.
some people are brought up to feel that it's wrong to ever express anger. Anger is dangerous. Anger is bad. Anger is sinful. Whatever
Yeah.
label you want to put on it. But they're taught that showing it ever, feeling it ever, allowing yourself to feel it is a bad, very dangerous thing. And yet, if you don't feel it, you can't deal with it.
Exactly. Well, our emotions are kind of like pressure that's built up in a soda bottle, right? This is a water bottle. But if this was a soda bottle, if our emotions, whether it's anger or grief or anxiety, if they start to build up, right, and we shake it up and we shake it up and we shake it up as the boys have been shaken their whole life, but we keep a tight lid on it, that pressure has to go somewhere. So what it's going to do is it's going to blow up, right? But there's another way of dealing with it, and that is by very gently opening the bottle and keeping it open so that the pressure can settle. And that means, slowly over time, learning to face our own experiences and sharing our emotions. Anger as an emotion is not a bad emotion, it's actually a very helpful emotion. It lets us know when we've been wronged or when people that we care about have been wronged, and it motivates us to take action. If we suppress it and do nothing, then we're more likely to act out. But many people confuse the emotion of anger and the action of aggression. Those are two different things. We can feel angry and, for example, stand up for somebody else in a compassionate, non aggressive way. And on the other hand, we can be angry and then act aggressively. But, that distinction, I think it's important to
Mhm.
remember.
It's also been interesting watching the show as 2020 unfolds
Yeah.
because the boys specialize in dealing with one apocalypse after another. And sometimes this year has sort of felt like one apocalypse after another. I think there's a hopefulness perhaps in watching that to say, okay, just because it's the apocalypse doesn't really mean it's the end of everything. There's something afterwards.
Yeah, I think it's so true. Uh, when COVID-19 was first classified as the pandemic, one of my first thoughts was, where is Sam and Dean when you need them, right? Because they don't usually deal with diseases, with the exception of pestilence, maybe. But
Croatoan.
but but recognizing that just because there's this worldwide threat doesn't mean it's over. I think it's a really big deal. Recognizing that what supernatural teaches us above all else is that A, there's always hope, and B, if we all pull together, we can do anything. And I think right now, during this pandemic, we all have a role to play, right? We all are monster hunters in real life in a lot of ways, whereby wearing masks, by following the protocols, we are protecting ourselves and other people. This is us fighting monsters right now. And so if we're able to follow the basic monster hunting rules, Monster Hunter 101, then I think we can defeat this monster and any other that comes along the way.
So one of the jokes that comes up a lot on Facebook memes about Supernatural is the Cards Against Humanity card that allows you to pick two things that describe Supernatural. And of course, the answer is demon possession and daddy issues. Sam and Dean have a lot of daddy issues. You know, Dean struggling with being his own man. It's not his music, it's not his car, it wasn't his coat, it wasn't his mission. Who is he and why is he still on this road? And then Sam, the prodigal son, the one who stood up to John and fought back. And neither of them, well, they were very young at the beginning, but neither of them were particularly doing it in an effective way. And yet those issues really stretch throughout the whole show until we finally get some closure when John comes back in season 13. Where do the daddy issues come in?
Well, I think that both of them grew up not only without a mother, but also without a father. Even though John was alive for most of their, or all of their childhood, they didn't see him very much. And so for Dean, he had to become the father figure. And I imagine that there's a lot of maybe even resentment, right? Anger and frustration. He never got to be a kid. And for Sam, he didn't really have that father-like figure. He had his older brother, but he's his brother. He's not his dad. He didn't have somebody to teach him how to be a boy. He didn't have somebody to be a compassionate role model. They always had to be in a life or death kind of mode, and they had to learn how to assemble guns at a young age. They had to learn how to kill monsters. But I think because they never got a chance to be kids, they never had that compassionate father-like figure in their life. That has really seeped into their mental health development throughout, not just in their childhood, but also in their adulthood.
But they did find a father figure later in Bobby Singer.
That's
Now,
true.
of course, they do lose Bobby, but
I know.
one of the reasons he is so important to them is that he fills in a lot of those holes that John left behind.
Yep.
And he did his best to do it, even when they were little, to the extent that he had any control over the situation.
That's very true. And I've often wondered how different things would have been if the boys lived with him full time, if this was something that was stable, right? Because as children, people need a secure attachment figure, right? Somebody that they can go to whenever they're scared, when they're going through a hard time. And they also need safety and they need consistency. And the boys never had any of those three factors. They had people who loved them, but they were not consistently present in their lives to give them what they needed.
And we get some of that backstory with Bobby in his in Death's Door when he's dying and he's replaying the greatest hits. And we realize, why he didn't have any children of his own, what kind of a traumatic background he came from. But he comes to own that when he stands up to his memory of his abusive father and says, I adopted two boys and they turned out to be heroes.
I know. I remember watching that episode for the first time. I was My husband and I were watching the show together, and he fell asleep right before that episode. We're kind of like binging on that season, and he woke up to me sobbing. And he said, "Who died?" And I said, "Bobby." And he said, "Oh no." And so the next day we watched it together and we both cried. It the That episode is one of my favorite episodes, and it's one of the most gut-wrenching episodes, I think, of the whole show. And what was really amazing to me was to see Bobby revisit that memory where he sees himself being abused as a little kid and doesn't only stand up to his abuser in that memory, but also gets a chance to support his little self.
His
And
little
that,
self protect his mother.
yes, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And what a self-compassionate, what a beautiful way of kind of fostering healing by revisiting that memory and supporting his little self, and of course supporting his mother. And that is actually something that we do in therapy. When somebody had been through something traumatic, we would invite them to revisit that memory, to stand up to the abuser in the memory, even if that is not how the actual event occurred, and then to comfort the little self.
Mhm.
And so that entire episode just had me in tears the entire way.
Yeah, it's a beautifully done episode. There's also the episode where Sam has to reintegrate himself after the Great Wall of Sam falls. He's fractured,
Yes.
and he has to confront his broken self, his soulless self, and then the one that is feeling all the pain,
Yes.
and deal with all of them to make himself whole again. There
Yep.
was a lot going on in that episode.
Certainly, certainly. And it wasn't just one episode, right? It was a little bit of an arc, but yeah, there was one specific. And I think that it's so true to what happens in our own lives. We build the wall to not confront our traumas, and sometimes it's it's purposeful avoidance, I should say, and sometimes we just repress and don't even realize that we're repressing a certain memory. And when that wall ruptures, and it does, we might be brought down to our knees. And as a trauma specialist, I primarily work with people with PTSD, and so I've seen it in so many cases where people might have repressed, let's say, witnessing a triple homicide, and or witnessing a family member being assaulted or abused, and years later when this memory oh, sorry, did I just cut out?
No, you're here.
Okay. And years later, when they're able to remember this event, then they might be devastated and overwhelmed and not know how to deal with this. And so in therapy, what we would do if something like this occurred is we would help the person to, first of all, find some grounding, some mindfulness. So for Sam, unfortunately, he's doing that through self harm, like through self injury, right? Like that's the only way he knows how to use grounding skills. If he can feel pain in his hand, then he can find himself again. He can have that touch with reality. In therapy, what we would do is to help people to, for example, feel the sensations of their feet, if that sensation is available, as a way to literally ground, right, to bring our attention back to the ground. If the sensation of the feet is not available, maybe due to a disability, we can notice the sensation of our hands or even the sensation of our lips, like this. But the idea would be to find some grounding, to build some space and safety around some of these experiences and memories, and then to create a timeline of somebody's life story, of somebody's events, and then to process these events slowly and over time so that they don't rupture like this again.
Yeah, I thought that that episode where Sam pulled those pieces back into himself and then was able to uh, accept and acknowledge and feel was an incredibly powerful episode.
Yeah, yeah, agreed.
One of the other things that I think a lot of us have been very happy to see in season, I think it was 12, 13, and 14, where Sam and Rowena could actually talk about having been traumatized by Lucifer
Yes.
and share some of what it felt like to have their agency taken away because both of them suffered terribly at his hands. Having that acknowledged and having them speak to each other seemed like a major turning point for the characters.
Absolutely. And I think that's a major point for a lot of people. Oftentimes, we're left to think that we're alone in our traumatic experience. We might think that nobody can understand us, and we might feel ashamed of what we went through. Understanding that another person has been through it and has suffered too creates something called common humanity, which means understanding that our experiences are common, human, that we're not alone. And being able to have that recognition builds not only a kinship with that person, but also destigmatize our experience and can promote healing. When I was writing supernatural therapy, what I actually did is I requested multiple supernatural fans to submit their stories so that they were able to support one another, even if they'd never met, through
Mhm.
this book. And then multiple actors from the show also submitted different kinds of quotes to support one another. And my goal for that was to create exactly what we're talking about, this experience of common humanity where people can share stories and then also learn mental health coping skills like how to practice grounding and mindfulness, how to process trauma, etc.
One of the things that also comes up a lot with Sam and in later seasons, even with Dean, is the whole concept of possession. And we can joke that Sam's been repossessed more often than a cheap Ford, but you know, the guy has been. There was Meg, there was
Yeah,
Lucifer,
yeah,
there was Gadriel,
yeah.
and Crowley briefly in there pushing Gadriel out. And at the time in season 9, Dean was so fixed on saving Sam that he didn't seem to grasp the violation of being possessed.
Yeah.
And it isn't until Dean's actually been a demon, experienced the mark of Cain, which took away a lot of his will and his control, and then was possessed by Michael, that he seemed to finally get it and understand what was going on there. That whole idea of violation is a huge theme in the show, and getting past it. Um, where does that come in?
Yeah, I think so often we might be so preoccupied with helping somebody, we might not think about what they want, right? And whether it's, when we're talking about actual possession or when we're talking about maybe overstepping and like overreaching, in terms of reaching out to somebody or showing up to their house, because we think that they might need support, but they might have repeatedly told us, hey, I just want to be left alone. Sometimes we might not recognize what somebody else might be asking and the boundary that they're setting. And so it's a really fine line between helping somebody and then also honoring their boundary. And sometimes until we've been in that situation, it's really hard to gauge.
I think it's also interesting that the show has obliquely but frequently inferred that there may have been, probably was, some kind of sexual violation when Sam and Lucifer were in the cage.
Yeah.
And you don't often see, particularly a male lead, dealing with that kind of trauma. In true Winchester fashion, they don't really ever sit down and talk about it. That's what fan fiction is for. But I think it's very interesting that that's part and parcel of Sam's PTSD. And when Lucifer comes back and comes back and comes back, he taunts Sam with
Yeah.
that. And that's
Yeah.
part of the powerlessness.
Absolutely. And I think that a lot of people don't talk about sexual assault, people of all genders,
Mhm.
but I think that men are even less talk about it. Excuse me, men are even less likely to talk about it because they're more likely to unfortunately be shamed, as if there's any shame about going through trauma, right? The shame belongs with the perpetrator, not with the person that was abused. I believe the latest statistics are something like 1 in every 2 women in the United States likely has faced some kind of sexual abuse or harassment, and I think it's 1 in every 7 men. And so what that means is that and of course we don't know the statistics for non-binary individuals and other gender minorities. And so what that means is that a lot more people probably have gone through sexual assault than are likely to talk about it. And unfortunately, if people are able to come forward, a lot of times they're not met with support. I remember there was this New York Times headline where I think it was a sailor, so somebody in the US Navy, that came forward about sexual assault that he went through, and he told his doctor, his Navy doctor, and the doctor said, "Son, men don't get raped." And that was the headline. And it was so heart-wrenching.
Mhm.
This very courageous man stepped forward and reported his abuse, and instead his doctor, who was supposed to look out for him, shamed him and wouldn't help him. In my work, I do work with a lot of survivors of sexual assault, and I see people all across the gender spectrum. So I had that feeling as well when I was watching the show. I was actually hoping that the show would go a little bit deeper with it, because I think that for so many survivors, it would be really empowering to see that storyline. But I do think you're right. I think that it did hint at it.
I really think we could probably just stay here all night talking about supernatural and the psychological aspects, but I do want to touch on, you've written other books tapping into other fandoms and almost coming at it from an archetypal way. What attracted you to meld psychology and fandom as an approach?
Thank you. So I'm a trauma survivor myself. I was born and raised in Ukraine, and I'd been through Chernobyl radiation. So as a kid, I spent a lot of my childhood in and out of hospitals. And when Soviet Union broke up, my family and I were targeted. And so I'd been through a lot of prejudice, and I lost 60% of my family in the Holocaust. And so the trauma is not unfamiliar to me or my family. And moving to United States, what really helped me to process trauma was seeing the first X-Men film. It's so seeing the X-Men who had been prejudiced against for being different, seeing characters that had also been exposed to radiation, seeing characters that were able to band together and share their trauma stories and use them to help other people. It just completely revolutionized the way within I understood my own experience. And for the first time, instead of seeing myself as a victim, I saw myself as a survivor. And so it was because of seeing that movie, I wanted to incorporate stories to help people. And then over time, it just organically happened, starting with Superman and other DC and then Marvel characters when I was working with active duty Marines who had just returned from Afghanistan and Iraq. And I found that it was a lot easier for folks to talk about fictional characters than it was for them to talk about their experiences, but they were able to draw parallels to explain what they were going through.
Mhm.
People would talk about deployment as a scene from The Walking Dead, or they would talk about their losses as the way that Bruce Wayne witnessed the death of his parents when he was a small child. And that was easier for folks to explain what they were going through, and it made them feel understood. And so over time, I started incorporating pop culture into therapy to help people understand that they're not alone in facing trauma, and that every hero had been through it, and that perhaps this is the beginning of their hero's journey. And so I found that just about every fandom there is can be helpful in aiding people to discover their post-traumatic growth, whether it's Supernatural, Harry Potter, the Avengers, right? You name it. And I think that when individuals feel that pull within that fandom, it can help them to really find themselves.
I totally agree. And I think that there's also the empowerment of seeing people coming from maybe being broken or oppressed in the beginning and rising to become superheroes. And
Yes,
so, if they can do it, then that's a template. That is a model. And
absolutely.
Absolutely a very powerful thing. Now, in your book, you talk about finding a hunter's toolbox and facing your monsters and embodying your hunter mentality. I love the way you really tie the show back into the psychological concepts. Can you talk a little bit about that, please?
Sure, thank you. I think that sometimes reading a self-help book can be challenging. I'm a big fan of self-help books, but I know sometimes it might be hard to find that connection. And so I wanted to use the kind of language that a lot of folks will be able to understand. And instead of just using psychology language, I wanted to use supernatural language in this book. I've used Harry Potter language in Harry Potter therapy book that I wrote. And so I wanted this book to feel like a personalized toolbox specifically for the reader. And so for my hope is that for supernatural family members, this book will function as almost like your own Monster Hunter's journal that will feel like it was written specifically for you.
That's a terrific approach, and certainly not as intimidating as many other ways of coming at the same kind of concepts. I love how, you talk about becoming a hunter and you are the chosen one.
Thank
What do
you.
you mean by that?
Thank you. And, we see this concept of the chosen one in just about every story, right? Including Supernatural, where Sam and Dean are the chosen ones to save the world. And I think that each and every person is a chosen one within their own hero's journey, within their own life. And I think that so often we might think that we're not important. We might think of ourselves as just a sidekick in someone else's story because maybe that's how we were raised. But the truth is that each and every one of you is the hero of your journey. You have the ability to make choices. You have the ability to change not only your life but the lives of other people. And so my hope is that through learning certain coping skills, you'll be able to become your own version of a monster hunter and be the hero in this particular realm of your hero's journey of your world.
Wow, that is so powerful and so empowering. That's just terrific. Well, like I said, I'm pretty sure we could spend the rest of the evening talking here, and we have done a couple of another panel, and we've got some more that we've talked about doing. So this isn't goodbye. This is just wrapping things up for now. But before we end, could you please tell folks where they can find you and your other books and connect online?
Absolutely. So you can find me on Twitter at Shadow Quill, quill like a feather. I'm on Instagram, Dr. Janina Scarlet Official, and my website is superhero-therapy.com. All my books can be found on my website if you just click the page called Books, or you can find them in your local bookshop or just about anywhere where books are sold.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking time to be here with us today. And
Thank
we
you.
will we will definitely talk again. Thank you folks for being with us also here at Continual. Stay tuned. There's a lot more supernatural coming up here at Continual. We'll see you online.